After a quarter of researching cultural progress, our group devised a thesis that said, through cultural interaction, we as a nation can progress as a more united people, to the effect, if we are all accepting of each other's oppositions. Do you agree or disagree with this thesis, and why?
Part of what divides the country is we get so passionate about our own beliefs that we forget that other perceptions do exist. And I think the more that we are able to put ourselves in other people's shoes, it would be easy for us to at least be understanding. But you still have to understand that in our particular culture, it's okay to believe just about anything you want because of our freedoms that are provided to us in the First Amendment.
What cultural difference do you think affects our society the most?
I think the biggest cultural difference is it's politically based, but I think a lot of it stems around religion. Because we are a free country, we have the freedom to express ourselves religiously in any way we wish. The further into our country's history we go, we're getting more complex religions through the process of immigration. I think that's a good thing, but sometimes a little dicey on how that works, so it causes conflict. One specific thing that you're seeing in society today is in regards to Islam, because of Islamic terrorism that does exist. So sometimes you're seeing that people aren't as tolerant of certain religions when they should be. So we're seeing the negative aspects of it rather than focusing on the positives.
Do you think food, music, and language bring people together or separate them?
I think all three of those basically brings people together because if you speak the same language as people, it's easier to communicate. There's something about whether you're from a particular culture that involves food and music. I think the more you get to know about food, I love food. So I am all about learning different cultural foods that exist. And I think the more I know about somebody's food, the more I know about them. It kind of goes along with the phrase, you are what you eat, right? Especially when you learn about different practices, not just what type of food you're eating, but how they eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Is there breakfast, lunch, and dinner? Is it more formal sitting at a table? Is it like it is in America a lot of times? Everybody just fends for themselves and you sit in your own room and watch your own TV channel. So I think it just depends on the people, but I think you learn a lot about people's culture when you look at food and music.
Do you think other cultural influences are affecting us negatively, causing us to separate?
Sometimes I think it's the people who currently feel that their culture is the right way to live. Their interpretation of other cultures is causing the problem. I mentioned in an earlier question about particular culture of Islam and Islam religion and how the basis of it and accepting of it should be something that everybody does. But some people are having a hard time understanding something like Islamic terrorism is different than what most people of Islam religion believe. So I think that when you bring in more cultures and more people start to migrate to America because it is free, I think just the initial reaction of people is to not accept others. Unfortunately, I think they should. So in some ways, I think it is negatively causing us to separate, but I don't blame those other cultural influences. I actually blame people who are less willing to accept other cultures.
Do you think the Black Lives Matter movement will ever be resolved, or will it continue to affect America?
So I think to some extent, many groups like Black Lives Matter are going to always exist. I may not necessarily fall in line completely with the beliefs of, for example, Black Lives Matter movements. But what I think that it does is it causes discussions that wouldn't happen initially. So even though I don't necessarily think everything that the movement is arguing for is correct, I do think it's necessary for them to exist in order to start conversations. Unfortunately, sometimes it looks negative because they aren't consistent in necessarily what they're arguing for. So, one of the things you see with Black Lives Matter right now is a lot of the situations involving police and citizens. And you're seeing them 100% all the time arguing for the victim. Sometimes they are accurate, sometimes they are not. And unfortunately, sometimes that's what causes a divide. But what they have done is they have brought into the public light some of the issues with police brutality that do exist, that were being ignored. Some of those are legitimate, some of them are not. But I think what, at the very least, they've been able to do is bring an issue to the forefront and help us have a discussion. And I think most accurately, the way you can look at some of those situations is to just do that. Look at each of them individually. Sometimes we want to say blanketly across the board, either all police are correct or every victim was correct, when really each individual case should be handled individually.
Do you think that the Blue Lives Matter movement will help or hinder the Black Lives Matter movement, and why?
My hope would be that it helps both sides, because if you have one side of, I don't want to necessarily say extreme, but it's kind of the extreme one side of the Black Lives Matter movement, the only way to have rational conversations is probably to be able to have an extreme other side. So that would be that the Blue Lives Matter. When really I think most people generally would say, well, both of them matter. But by just having one extreme side of the equation, you're not really having rational conversations. You got to have both sides. So my hope is that it will help both sides, because now you have two perceptions and you can have those rational conversations. If you just have one side, both of them should be benefited by that.
Do you think the election has affected our culture?
Definitely. We've talked about the elections for months now, and I think they definitely have an effect on our culture. Most oftenly during the election process, it's negatively, because we have such polarizing political parties that everybody feels like they have to pick a side, and when they do pick a side, all of a sudden the other side thinks that you're a horrible person, and it doesn't matter what side you're on. We have two parties to pick from. Technically, you don't have two parties to pick from, but everybody feels like they have to pick between two parties. And by doing that, they've chosen which side they belong to. Now, most people would tell you and be honest with you that on certain issues they believe the one party's correct, on other issues they believe the other party's correct. So really, most people do actually fall in the middle, but by being forced to pick a person, they sort of divide the culture naturally. And I think that's one of the downfalls of the two-party system that we belong to right now. So I think it affects the culture during the election year negatively, but most of the time that sort of dwindles as the following years progress. And it's like every 4 years we're reminded that we hate each other, when really it shouldn't be that way.
Do you think Trump or Clinton would do a better job as president regarding uniting the various cultures of America, and why?
So if you just look at the surface of this question, I think most people would generally say that they think Clinton would do a better job regarding uniting various cultures. See, this question, if you'd asked me this beforehand, I wouldn't have as much evidence, but since the elections have already happened, I can look at the exit polls and see kind of how people voted. And you can see that Trump had pretty well one demographic that he was able to reach to, and it was the middle white class of America, both males and females he reached, whereas Clinton reached the majority of the minority groups. So most people would look at that and say that in itself would explain the uniting the various cultures in America. So I don't necessarily think either of them is going to do a great job of uniting cultures, but I think the policies that are put in place of uniting the cultures, because she already has the support, where people are likely to follow her and those principles. And some of the rhetoric that Trump used in the election process is more divisive now, because I don't necessarily think either of them would have done a great job at this, and in 4 years we'll all be able to evaluate again and decide. But I think just the fact that Clinton is able to reach more groups and get more support from more groups appears that. Now the other side of that is that could be also divisive, right? Because Trump supposedly got supporters from the forgotten men and women in middle class white America. So those opinions matter too. So in some ways, whoever was going to win, it was going to be divisive, because they weren't getting split votes in different areas. It was pretty well divisive leading up to the election. So my hope is now that the election's over, regardless of who won, so we know Trump won, and you already see that him, Hillary Clinton, and President Obama are all talking about uniting and coming together. And Trump has actually taken steps back in his initial rhetoric during the campaign. So my hope is now that has happened, you're going to see a more united country. And I think you would have seen that happen regardless of who won the election. Because the campaign was so negative, both sides were going to have to do whatever they could to get the other side to believe in them, because if you look at the popular vote, it was basically split down the middle. Now, Clinton wound up winning that by a few 100,000 votes, but a few 100,000 votes is nothing when you're looking at 300 million people in the country. I'm optimistic to think that now that the election's over, both sides will do what they can to bring people together.
Relating the question 5, according to Pew Research Center, 39% of blacks feel that situations in black communities are getting better, as in 2007, only 20% felt better about it. Now, more than half of blacks claim that their future will be even better. So this statement is more of a positive agreement, but what Mr. Franzen claims is more of a neutral statement.
Relating to question 2, according to Michelle LeBron from Beyond Interact, though it does not cause it. When differences surface in families, organizations, or communities, culture is always present, shaping perceptions, attitudes, behaviors, and outcomes. This statement is more neutral from what Mr. Franzen claims. He claims more of a negative statement.